Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Easy Conversations podcast, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Dandia. In this week's episode, I sit down with Mike J. Mike is the host of the How Did That Work Out podcast. Mike shares his story of being a part of the U.S. military and being involved in 2 wars, and then the aftermath of being a war veteran. Mike talks about the onset of PTSD from his experiences and how that has impacted his life. Mike and I also talk about normalizing mental health and feeling comfortable in speaking about our struggles. I hope you can get a lot out of this episode, and if at the end you can leave a 5-star review, I would truly appreciate it. Great, Mike J, welcome to the Easy Conversation podcast. Super excited to have this conversation today, and I'm really grateful that you're willing to take the time to have this conversation with me today. For people that don't know, Mike J, you've got your own podcast. How did it work out for you? But before we jump into our conversation today, I want to just give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and what it is that you do.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Furkan. Thanks for having me on. I'm Mike J. I'm an aspiring podcaster in the sense that I've got about 8 episodes of a podcast out that nobody's heard yet. At least that's what the stats tell me. The name of the podcast is How Did That Work Out? And you can find it obviously on Spotify. We're on Red Circle as our main platform as well. When I'm not fighting crime, I'm actually, a senior IT professional. I've been doing the IT thing for about 30 plus years. Won't say much more than that, otherwise I'll give away my age. 2-time soldier, a couple of combat tours in there as well. Father of 3 children, husband to a gorgeous wife who I just absolutely adore. Second marriage, which is why she's awesome. So glad to be here. Thanks again, Furkan.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And there's a few things you touched on, like I guess the 2 tours you did, like maybe if you don't mind, like getting into that, like how was that and what did that feel like from first of all, the impact it had on your family and then also your mental health?
Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah. So, there's a little bit of onion to kind of unpack there, kind of peel. And that is when I first went, it was during I enlisted in the Army at age 17, right after high school. So I started school a year earlier than most. And so I graduated a year earlier than most. And so 3 weeks after I graduated high school, I was reporting for duty for the U.S. Army. My specialty was technical in nature, so it wasn't like I was a grunt or, anything, none of the combat arms, but my specialty did require me to go out to the theater of combat. And that is because, I worked on top secret communications equipment. And so obviously, units out in the field have to talk secretly to the, headquarters. So I was actually one of only 7 people in my main unit that had a high enough clearance to actually operate the equipment that was out there for the units we were assigned to. So they picked us, 7 of us, from our home unit and then loaned us out. So I was right at about 21 when I went. So I was kind of an older guy, but that was my 4th year in the Army. So I was coming toward the end of my enlistment, and a lot of the other soldiers were a lot younger. So that was in 91. That was during Desert Storm.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the culmination of a lifelong dream, believe it or not, as sick as that sounds. I'd always wanted to be a soldier ever since I was little. We never played cops and robbers, or at least I never did. I played, Army.
Yeah.
And, my dad was in the military. He glorified it, quite a bit. And I wanted to be like my dad. And so ever since I could remember, I wanted to be a soldier. And, becoming a soldier, obviously part of that realization. Then the other part is, fighting, in a war for your country, and all the romantic notions that go with it. And so in 91, I went over. Thankfully, I was only there for about 3 months. When the ground campaign right before the ground campaign started. So the air war was going on,
Mm.
and a lot of new sights and sounds. I mean, even being in the military, you're not prepared to see, jets taking off in full afterburner. You're not prepared, to, hear artillery unless you're in those areas, right? And for me, I was, inside of a mountain underground at an alternate U.S. command and control facility.
Mhm.
And so to be out there with all the real gear and where the where the real stuff is happening was quite an assault on the senses, right? And so not long after I got to my unit, the ground war started. They gave us a briefing before, and it was an invasion. So we thought it might be like D-Day. We were going to cross the border from Saudi Arabia into Iraq, crossing, well, we were near a neutral zone. So we were poised to attack inside of Iraq as part of that pincer movement that, if you study up on the history of it all, our commanding general Schwarzkopf had devised basically an ancient maneuver that was
Mm.
done, when swords were a thing,
Yeah.
where he sent a frontal force to have the enemy think that's the bulk of it, and they're going to send everybody to that frontal force, and then he had a whole bunch of us kind of swing to the left and close a gate to prevent the enemy from escaping, essentially. And so I was part of that maneuver, right, that did the closing off maneuver.
Hmm.
So the effect was I was in the Battle of 73 Easting, which is a battle now in the history books, and it was the largest tank battle since World War II at the time, if not still.
Hmm.
And that's where we essentially decimated the Republican Guard upon their retreat. And so there were a lot of surrenders. We didn't deal with any surrenders, but saw my first real death during that time. And the experience, while overwhelming and while I guess, a story you can certainly tell your grandchildren, um, I still get nightmares to this
Hmm.
day for the things that I saw and experienced. And the hardest part about coming home, aside from adjusting that you're actually sleeping, in a building, you're actually sleeping in a room and not underneath the stars, because we slept underneath the stars most of our, actual walls and a ceiling. I would think for a couple of seconds that I was captured, combined with the fact that I had in the back of my head this it wasn't like a gripping fear or crippling. But it was a fear nonetheless that they would actually send me back. And so that was hard enough, right? And that took some adjustment. Even actually to this day, I still wake up and don't always remember where I am. And so I think, oh gosh, they got me, even to this. And I'm 51 and this thing happened in 91. But the absolute hardest was, when you're home, your parents, they're proud of you. They want to show you around, show you off. And so they introduce you. Hey, here's my son. He just got back from Desert Storm. And so you're shaking the hand of somebody you've never met before. And they shake your hand. They say, welcome home. And did you kill anybody? And that it floored me, because obviously the first time it happened, it floored me. But even like the fifth time it happened, it still floors me. Even to this day, it floors me, because how insensitive can you be? Now, thankfully, the answer is no one. However, that doesn't mean I didn't see things. That doesn't mean I didn't experience things. So after I got back from Desert Storm, again, it was a 3-month stint, but it was all action. It was the 100-hour war, but it was 100 hours worth of action, and then we had to redeploy back home, and that took a little while. But so I got married young. I got out of the Army, actually. Excuse me. I got out of the Army within a month after getting home. My enlistment was over, and I didn't re-enlist. So I went back home, and I got married all too young. And then, flash forward 13 years, and then we have 9/11.
Hmm.
I'm in my early 30s by then. I'm about at least 80 pounds overweight. And after 9/11, I went to a recruiter's office and said, "Hey, I'm prior service." That's the term you use for somebody who's been in. They got out.
Yep.
I'm prior service. Just wondering if you could use my help. And he's like, "Well, certainly we could, but not in the shape you're in right now." I go, "Well, that's a given." I said, "But if I do the work, will you guys, take me back?" And he said, "Yeah, absolutely." And he almost said it like disbelievingly.
Yeah.
So I, so I went to work.
Mm-hmm.
I dieted. I worked out 6 days a week. I turned every opportunity at the job that I was doing at the time to kind of also be a workout. So I lost 80 pounds in 7 months. Um, and then I went and took my physical, and I was able to join the Army Reserves. So I was in a combat engineering unit. And I remember one of my they used to call them drills. Now they call them battle assemblies.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my first times, new unit, I don't really know anybody, but I asked the sergeant that's in charge of our platoon or our squad. I said, "Hey, Sarge, and you can tell I've been to combat because I have what's called a combat patch. So it's a patch on your right shoulder that indicates at a glance that you've been there. You've been at least in the theater of combat."
Yeah.
So I said, "Hey, Sarge," and I was a PFC by that because I had lost a stripe because I'd been out for 13 years. So I went in
Yeah.
as a PFC. So here I am, a 32-year-old PFC, which is kind of old for a PFC, saying, "Hey, Sarge, when do we prepare?" And he goes, "Prepare for what?" And I go, "Prepare for war." Because it was after 9/11,
Yeah.
and everybody around, because it was outside, everybody around just started laughing. They were just laughing, and I'm like, "What's so funny?" And they're like, "Dude, if they send us to war, then they're at the bottom of the barrel." And I said, "I don't think so. This is an all hands on deck situation, y'all." And they said, "Well, we'll see." And so the very next weekend that we had drill, I got promoted to specialist, which is a technical corporal. And not long after that, we got the call that we're going.
Mm.
And it was during that time, while we were preparing to go over, right before we went over, they promoted me to sergeant. And so that one was longer. It was a year. But we were also preparing to go over at a stateside base, it's Fort Hood in Texas. And so we spent about 3 months there getting ready, getting our shots, but also training, because we had to train for, even though we were combat engineers, we still had to learn how to, put up hasty roadblocks, conduct searches, kick in doors. I mean, we had to learn, all of that, and then relearn, what to do when you hear mortars coming in and things like that. And so anyways, after that, we went over and spent a year out there. And we were in an area called Taji. It was actually outside the city of Taji. And what most people don't know about Taji is that when the second Battle of Fallujah was happening and the Marines were basically kicking the insurgents out of Fallujah, they
Mm-hmm.
all congregated over at Taji. So they
Yeah.
were to harass our base like every day, every night. And we'd also have to take on missions outside the wire. So that one wasn't as graphic, if you will. I mean, we did have a car bomb go off outside our gate, and because we're combat engineers, we had equipment to help clean up that mess, if you will. But it was prolonged, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we were, under some kind of hostile fire, maybe not directly, but almost every day. And of course, those chances went up when you went on a convoy, because convoys were a big thing back then. So at first I thought, okay, well, that's, I think it's a healthy thing for me personally, because it's some unfinished business. Plus, I felt like I was truly serving a purpose. As I was getting older, I wanted to pass something on to a new generation of soldiers that hadn't experienced at least what I did in 91. And even though it's only 3 months, as they say, you grow up quick. And so after my contract actually ran out halfway through my tour over there.
Yeah.
And a part of me hoped they'd send me home, but they wouldn't do that. You finish your tour.
Yeah.
So instead, just gritted my teeth, finished my tour. And then not long after getting home, I got out yet again with, feeling like I really fulfilled a purpose. But the mental stuff, it's still with me. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
know how else to put it, Furkan, but I still get, not as often maybe. I mean, I'll go nights without, but some nights I'll get, really, really bad nightmares. I can't be in crowded areas. Um, we went to a festival a few years back, and all the classic symptoms: sweating,
Yeah.
hypervigilant, trembling, uh, ready to jump out of your skin because you feel like you need to be doing something to secure yourself and the ones you're with, my wife and my
Right.
in-laws and my kids. I felt like I should be doing something to secure them because we're in a crowd and somebody's going to try something.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my two tours. They were
Yeah.
13 years apart. For me, some unfinished business, just in the personal sense.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. Just one thing, I guess, for listeners, like, what is PFC? I know you mentioned that earlier.
Oh yeah, private first class.
Okay.
So in the U.S. Army, you have a private, what they used to call a slick sleeve, which is no rank at all. Then you have a PV2, which is one stripe. Okay, and we call those mosquito wings. And then PFC is the one stripe with what we call a rocker, that little
Mm-hmm.
arch underneath it. So that's a PFC.
Okay.
Basically, uh, an E3 pay grade, right? So there's E1, E2, E3, E4, E5 is sergeant, and on up are different variants of sergeant.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess one of the things I wanted to explore, so you mentioned coming back from your first tour, you had the nightmares, obviously a lot of the symptoms of PTSD, but you still decided to go back. What kind of, were you aware that the symptoms you were experiencing were because of your tour? And if so, what made you decide to go back again for a second tour?
Yeah, excellent question. So, I mean, I knew I had PTSD the first time because the nightmares were so severe. And there were even times where I'd be, I guess you could call them night terrors, where I'd be screaming in my sleep and I wouldn't even realize that I was doing that. And only until my then wife would, tell me the next morning, you were like screaming out your brother's name and you were sweating profusely. So I knew I was exhibiting the symptoms, and thanks to our Vietnam brethren before us, PTSD was able to actually be diagnosed as, rather than just calling it shell shock like they used to do in the wars previous. Um, so, in terms of that and in re-enlisting, there were a couple of reasons. Number one, I was not in the best of places when the war broke out, the second war. Not in the
Yeah.
best of places. I had been just really run through the ringer with an awful divorce that ruined me financially, at the time emotionally,
Mm-hmm.
and my access to my children was being severely limited. And I had moved out of state. That was my doing, to try to get a better job. And
Mm-hmm.
when I got there, the job wasn't there. So I was trapped in another state thinking I was going to make, good money and be able to see my kids more regularly. And so instead I kind of got stranded. So I'm thinking, I don't know when I'm going to see my kids. I'm sitting here on the couch watching these guys, tear into another country that, you know, I know later, we knew that was all BS, but at the same time, that was my country. Those were my fellow soldiers, if you will. So I thought, I'm in my early 30s. I have something to give still. I'm still viable as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew I was overweight, but I did it. That was my life's mission. I worked out all the time. I watched what I ate. I went on a low carbohydrate diet. And so I was probably in the best shape since I was like 20 years old.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of it was, hey, I don't know if I'm going to see my kids again. Hey, there's combat pay. You'd be full time, even though if you're a reservist, if you get sent over, you get full time military pay, plus the danger pay and all that stuff. So I thought, well, maybe there's a way I can catch up on my child support. And, if I get greased while I'm over there, then, at least my kids get a nice, insurance payout.
Yeah, no, and I can imagine like the situation you were in, but do you feel like it was one of those things that you had lost pretty much your identity as a husband, your identity as a father. You mentioned that, the job you went for, you didn't get. So was that more you went to something that felt familiar, which was going to war? That's something you had experienced before. It gave you purpose, and it was something that was familiar.
Furkan, I hadn't really thought of it like that, but you have hit it right on the head. I mean, truly. I mean, I was living in a house, but it wasn't mine. I had the only thing I really owned, right, was my car, my stereo, and my TV.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you're right. I mean, yes, you could say your purpose is to, support your children, but I wasn't able to see them. And this was
Mm-hmm.
before Skype and Zoom and all that.
Of course.
So yeah, so you're right. I needed something to wrap both arms around that was bigger than myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I know being a dad is bigger than myself. So, I mean, I was working a job. It was a full-time job, but it was a little above minimum wage. But, aside from, putting gas in the car to get there, I was sending, everything that I could toward a massive child support bill.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, for me, it made financial sense, right, to reenlist. But it also, like you said, it made sense for somebody who was looking for that purpose. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that really, got me there, right? Something to work toward, something to achieve, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something that, I guess I could be proud of, and maybe even my kids, right? I think I wanted to measure up to my kids, and they were little at the time, but,
Yeah.
when they grew up, maybe they would appreciate what their dad did,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of see me as that hero, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So.
for sure. And I think you mentioned like earlier that the whole reason you got into the army was because it was a childhood dream of yours. Did it feel like how you'd envisioned it as a child, like when you started doing it, or did it feel like something completely different and you're like, well, this is not what I wanted to do?
Yes to all of the above. So yeah, I mean, it was a big dose of reality. I'd never really been away from home, and here I was, 17 years old. I was, living. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, so here I left Los Angeles, had to take a cross country flight, make 4 different connections, because when you're flying on the government dime, they send you the cheapest way possible. So
Mm-hmm.
I had like 3 or 4 different connections to get to South Carolina. And so, reality smack number one was when you get off that plane, the air is so thick and muggy, you could cut it with a knife because of the humidity. And, being in LA, you didn't really experience that kind of humidity. I was like almost gasping for air because it was like so thick.
Yeah.
So that was reality number one. Reality number two is you got these drill sergeants yelling at you, and you see them at the movie, in the movies. It's a lot different when you're the one they're barking at.
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so that was reality number two. And then the third biggest reality was that even though I wanted to be a soldier, I knew things that my dad taught me. But one thing he didn't teach me was how to be the everyday soldier.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, he taught me survival skills. He taught me, how to, escape and evade. But he didn't teach me anything about shining boots or waxing floors or, scrubbing toilets for that matter.
Yeah.
So it turns out that even though I wanted to be a soldier, and this when I was 17, so I knew nothing at the time, and it turns out I was basically a real life Gomer Pyle,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I was doing everything wrong. If they'd say right face, I'd turn to the left. If it could be done wrong, uh, I was able to do it, and yet it turned out to be a blessing because on my own, I knew I wasn't living up to my own ideal.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if I'm always getting busted out for doing the wrong thing, well, then the only way to stop getting busted out is start doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And if what I'm trying isn't working, it's time to try something new. And so what I did is that, when it came to like if your boots weren't shined well enough, the drill sergeant would stomp on your feet. And of course, whatever shining you did do, it would scuff them, but also, your feet would hurt pretty
Yeah.
badly. So I found the guy whose boots never got stomped on, and I asked him, "Will you show me how to shine your boots?" And he said, "Sure." I found the guy whose bed never got tossed because it was always done right. It was the bed was tight, and it was always to regulation, and his bed never got thrown over. So I asked him, "Will you show me how you make your bed?"
Mm-hmm.
Go, "Yeah, absolutely." The right face, left face stuff, the guy that was the best, I asked him, "Will you show me how to do an about face, a left face, a right?" We call that drill and ceremony. But
Yeah.
anyway, I asked him, "Will you show me?" So I took the best of every element that I was failing at badly and asked the best to mentor me.
Mm-hmm.
And they did. And so by the end of the training cycle, I had been like the most improved soldier. And I didn't know until after, I graduated. My drill sergeant said, "We were one meeting away from sending you home because you just weren't getting it."
Yeah.
And he goes, "My gosh, you've lost weight. Nobody can touch you in drill and ceremony. I mean, gosh, he just named the list of things that they couldn't touch me in anymore, that I had just was able to pretty much master."
Mm-hmm.
And that felt great because first of all, I didn't know I was going to get sent home. That was my own standard I wasn't living up to. Secondly, I was actually nominated and was on the honor guard at my permanent duty station because of my drill and ceremony. So I was on the honor guard, which meant I was on the firing squad. So we would do funerals for veterans.
Mm-hmm.
And, you had the pallbearers that would also fold the flag. And then you had the firing squad that would do the 21 gun salute. And I was on the firing squad that did the 21 gun salute because you have to be very precise
Yeah.
with your movements and such. So I'd done that for about 3 years.
Yeah, no, and I think that's an important point you make, that, often we should be comfortable enough to ask for help. And that's exactly what you did. And I would like to relate that to anytime we're struggling, is identifying where we need help and not being afraid to ask for it. And it's so important. And I think you also touched on it earlier about how your dad had glorified being in the Army, but until you didn't go there, you didn't realize that it's not all what they make it look like in the movies. There's a lot of other stuff going on. I guess one of the things I wanted to touch on was like, how's your relationship with your kids now? And what are the things you're doing to maintain that relationship?
That's a really good question. Again, when I went over there the second time, I didn't have kids the first time, but I had 3 boys the second time. And they were like, one was like 5, the other one was 7, and then the other one was like 10.
Mm-hmm.
So they were pretty little. So when I would call from overseas, they were so little they didn't quite grasp what was going on. So if I'm call them on the phone, and been standing out in line to try to get wait to get to a phone, and you call them and you've only got so many minutes on a prepaid card, again, different time.
Yeah.
They would kind of be enthralled with what was on TV rather than talking to their dad. And I didn't get mad at that. I just thought, wow, maybe one day they'll understand, that keeping in touch was, really a kind of a thing you look forward to, a saving grace out there. So yeah, my kids actually came to live with me when I got back from that war. So
Mm-hmm.
the second time, I actually got custody of my children. So they were preteen. They were, basically in grades, just finishing grade school and about to enter middle school. And then my oldest was already in middle school. So I got to enjoy them. I got to raise them essentially the second part of their adolescence, right? Second half
Yeah.
of their adolescence. And that was a real, both a thrill and an honor. And so, the relationship was good. I mean, I had my battles that I was fighting unbeknownst to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't want them to kind of see the suffering. And I had made a determination not to glorify, but also not to tear down military service, right? I mean, in other words, I love my country. I fought for it twice,
Yeah.
but I didn't want to pressure my children into doing the same in order to measure up in some way to their dad.
Yeah.
I didn't put that on them. Whatever they wanted to be, I was going to support that. And of course, your minds are going to change about 8 or 50 times when you're young. But then when my younger two were in high school, they were interested in joining the Army. And they're a year and a half apart. So when the one was interested, the other was interested.
Yeah.
And they were talking to a recruiter, and I said, I mean, guys, and I wanted to know why specifically are you doing this? I want to make sure they were doing it for the right reasons and not the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
Not so that dad would accept them, because I love them. I mean, unconditional love. You have kids, and Furkan, hopefully, you know what I'm saying here is
Of course.
when you have children, you finally understand what the term unconditional love really means.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they didn't need to do anything like that to make me proud of them. I just want them to be good, upstanding men, right? That have good values and that contribute to society rather than just take from it.
Yeah.
And that, do their best to make the very best lives for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So in any case, I asked them, well, hey guys, why are you looking into this? What's the real reason? And I'll be darned, they said the same things I said when I was 17. I love my country. I want to give back. I want to show my appreciation, and I want to defend this country that I love.
Mm-hmm.
And they never heard me say those things before. So I knew it came from them, directly. And I said, well, I can't argue with that. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to be part of that process. When you talk to the recruiters, you're going to talk to the recruiter at home with me there. Because I'm gonna be able to filter out any of the BS that they're going to tell you with reality. Yeah. And so it was very much a family process, and I felt better for it. The recruiters respected it. Maybe they didn't like it as much, but they respected it, and it ended up, I think, being a really good experience. So that at least the boys knew that. It's not something you rush into. B, you can never ask too many questions when it's a decision that big. And hopefully some of the questions I was asking made them kind of think a little more about what they were about to do. And now I'm proud to say they're both sergeants in the Army now. They made sergeant in their first enlistment, and they both re-enlisted. They're at the same base with different specialties, but they live like just up the road from one another.
Yeah, no, that's really, that's amazing. That's cool. And thank you for sharing that story. So, I'm glad to hear that you were able to come back and have a relationship with your boys and have that positive influence in their lives. I guess one of the last questions I wanted to touch on was, some of the symptoms you mentioned around PTSD from your two tours. I guess in trying to understand, like, what have you been doing for the past several years in order to deal with that, or and what are some things you could share?
Yeah. I would say that after the first war, I didn't do much of anything. Not because I didn't want to. When I got out of the Army, it took me like 6 months to get a job outside the military and to be able to use the specialty I was trained in. Again, it was a technical specialty. It was just a matter of waiting for the economy. I mean, when I got out, there was a recession. So it was just trying to kind of wait out the recession, and then finally there'd be demand for what I do in the military as a civilian. And so I ended up finally getting hired 6 months after I got out, and it was really, the nightmares were just getting unbearable. And so I snuck off to the VA and went and met with a psychologist there, and kind of told him what I was going through and where I had been and where what I'm doing now, and it's getting bad. And he said, I get it. He goes, I want to see you once a week. And but the VA is only open during normal business hours, and they don't work weekends. So I went to my boss, who was a Vietnam vet, by the way. Went to my boss and I said, look, boss, I said, I'm having some really bad nightmares, having troubles adjusting to civilian life right now, and I went to the VA and they'd like to see me on a weekly basis. He goes, man, he goes, nobody understands that more than I do. He goes, but I can't let you go. I can't spare you. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I needed the job.
Yeah.
Now there's laws, but back then there weren't the laws
Mm.
that we have now to kind of protect veterans. And again, I know he wasn't coming from a bad place, but he obviously had objectives he had to meet.
Yeah.
So he couldn't spare me. So I let it go untreated for quite a while. And then after this second time, it became debilitating. Where I remember the first episode I couldn't get out of bed for 2 weeks. So I literally called in sick for 2 weeks. Couldn't get out of bed. Was trying to hide it from the kids that I was actually experiencing this kind of trauma. And I was just so depressed, right? It was just depressed. I mean, you go from having almost these superhuman powers and abilities out there, not just because you have a gun, but we controlled the roads, right? We
Mm.
controlled the flow of just about anything and everything out there, right? And it wasn't like we were doing that maliciously. We were doing that to try to keep a country moving that needed help after ousting a dictator. And you're like, what do we do? So we were trying to, we as soldiers on the ground were trying to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I had my first episode. And then I went to go see a doctor. She prescribed me some anti-anxiety meds. That worked for a little while. So I thought, okay, I'm good. A couple of years later, it hit again, and it hit a little harder than the last time. So bad that actually I went to my primary doctor and said, Doc, I can't go back to work. I can't. I please. And she says, as of right now, you're under my care. She wrote a note, and she had me give it to my employer. It basically said, until further notice, he is under my care. So I was able to use a lot of the benefits, employee benefits with, not just health care, but also the time off and what have you. Because it was a toxic situation at work that just threw me into a spiral. I mean, a bad spiral. So I was out for about 6 months. But at that time, I went to a psychiatrist and I went to a counselor, both of which I still visit on a regular basis to this day. My counseling was once a week for a couple of years, and now it's once a month, but I still have it faithfully.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't want to even go without it. Even though there's nothing going on, it's nice to be able to have somebody to talk to.
Yeah.
And that can help you make sense of some things, So some days you're in a bad mood, your counselor can help you with that. Some days you're in a really good mood and you just have some random thoughts or
Yeah.
ideas, or, hey, am I crazy for thinking this thing? And they can maybe, help you sort that out. And then my psychiatrist is once every 3 months. And, I mean, I will admit openly, I am on medication, but it's helped, right? So the counseling and the medication together, have truly helped. I'm still the same guy. I'm not numbed or anything like that. I'm just a little more balanced, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But I'd like to circle back for to something you had said earlier about, asking for help. And, when I was in basic training, asking for that help. And, I had unfortunately had yet another episode after that one that had me seeing a counselor and a psychiatrist. Had yet another episode, was out for about another 6 months. And actually an Army buddy that I served with in the second war was in town. He's still in the military, and he came to visit me at home because he was in the area with his unit for some reason. So he came to see me, and I, kind of divulged. I said, man, I'm kind of having a rough go of it right now. Right now I'm on medical leave and, getting, help with my counselor and my psychiatrist. And he told me something, and I'm not pausing for dramatic effect. I'm pausing to try to kind of keep myself together here. He looked at me and he said, he goes, there's still a bit of a stigma out there that if you ask for help, you're weak. He goes, but I know of nobody stronger than you, and you just made yourself even stronger by asking for that help and accepting that help.
Mm-hmm.
And even to this day, when I picture the look on his face when he said it, the sincerity he said it with, we served side by side out there, and he knew that I was the one that, along with him, we would run toward the danger, not away from, and we would never shirk our responsibilities in any way. And we knew we could count on each other, right? And so for him to say that meant a lot more than just about anything anybody else could say to try to quote unquote make me feel better. So really for Con, I mean, for your listeners, you know, if you feel you need help, even if you don't think you're, you know, what you're going through is bad enough, if something in your if something in you says I could really use somebody to talk to, I could really use some help, just do it.
Yeah.
Don't make excuses for yourself. Don't try to put yourself down for even thinking that you need help. Just do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's amazing and beautiful. Thank you so much. And that's kind of the message I like to repeat to people also is, what makes you stronger is the ability to ask for help. It doesn't make you weak. And, you couldn't have summed it up any better. So, and that's kind of the message I like to tell people all the time. It's just, if you're feeling alone, if there's something you need help with, just ask for it. You never know how much it can help. Because I've been in that position, and just being able to let go and say, hey, I just need you to listen to me, or I just need someone to talk to. It makes a huge difference, because otherwise you're just choosing to suffer alone, and you don't know how far that suffering can take you.
Agreed, for a Con, and that's why I was so pleased to be invited onto your show, because your mission is legit. Your mission is noble. And I think that, you know, anybody listening to your podcast is lucky to be able to do so, so that you can provide that encouragement, you know, kind of that, hey, it's okay. And, you know, so anyway, I support you fully in your mission, and just so grateful that you let me just be that little part of it as well.
No, I appreciate those words. I keep telling the guests, and I've been so fortunate to have amazing guests like yourself, and they, all support me. So that just motivates me to keep doing it. And I am hopeful people do listen. So thank you so much. That means a lot. And I want to thank you again for coming on here and having this conversation with me. And I guess for listeners, if they want to get a hold of you, do you have a social media presence? I know you mentioned your podcast, but if they want to find you, what are some of the ways they can do that?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, on Instagram, we're at HDTWO show. So that's how did that work out? The acronym of it, HDTWO show. So we're on Instagram. We're also on Facebook as HDTWO show. We also have an email address, advice at hdtwo.show. So ADVICE at hdtwo.show.
Thank you again. Mike, I really appreciate you sharing your story, being vulnerable, and, coming on here and taking the time.
Thank you, for Con. And again, congrats on what you're doing, and best wishes on your endeavor.
Thank you. Well, that's the end of the episode. Thank you again for tuning in. As always, please leave a 5-star review. And until next week.